All righty, here we are. Welcome back, everybody. It's Alec, and we are getting ready to read some more of The Children of Arc. Last time I left you off somewhere in the middle of chapters 7 and 8, so we are going to continue that show this evening. All right. So let me go about a paragraph back so we can remember where we left off. Get yourself to safety, they called up to him. One went and checked on the third cop, but he was laying still and lifeless. They ran down Main Street, occasionally firing up at the beasts who were now pursuing them. One lingered to attack Richard. It was golden, and its green liquid spattered his shoulders and burned through his t-shirt. Some more of his training kicked in, and he gripped the handrail and threw himself over, dangling from the banisters like they were tree branches. He counted to 3 and eyed up the handrail, one landing down, letting himself fall, and grabbed onto it, now dangling closer to the ground. The golden hornet flew down, and Richard locked eyes with its little orange slits. Its toothy mouth salivated as it came for his hands. He let go and fell to the last landing, this time dangling with just one hand. He saw a few stacked trash bags, spilled out from their cans not too far from where he was hanging. Gross but potentially life-saving, he aimed for the bags as he let his hand slip free of the handrail. As he fell, the 2 cops ahead were set upon by the hornets, stingers plunging into the neck of one and the cheek of the other. Both men fell as Richard rolled off the soft trash bags, which had split open. He was covered in blood and filth, but he was alive. The hornets fluttered into the sky as he got to his feet. They guarded the street corner at 8th and Main. Richard didn't know in which direction to run. He couldn't get to Destination 6 if these bugs kept attacking him. He couldn't even get to his own apartment unless he figured out a way to sneak by them. The thought occurred to him to turn and run further into town, but just looking at all that smoke and wreckage, he knew he would die soon after. There was a roar, and the apartment building he had just escaped from shook. Dust fell, and the fire escape dislodged from the building, its parts tumbling down in sections that all made great squeals on impact. The hornets flew higher into the sky after all that noise, and Richard seized his opportunity, running under them, plunging down Main Street, clearing 7th and 6th before his body started pushing back on him. As he slowed, he heard wings fluttering behind him, and adrenaline pushed him further. He cleared 4th and 3rd, and his apartment came into view. Now he knew he would die before he reached Destination 6, so his apartment would be his hiding place. The bottom level was all stone. The stairwell had no windows. He could hide in there if he could just keep ahead of these creatures. When he neared his door, he was just about to collapse in pain. There were wings fluttering close behind him, and even with the adrenaline, he could barely move without gasping for air. He had stopped right next to the warehouse, the one with the Empire State mural. And as always, he felt a sudden compulsion towards the door, canceling out everything. One moment he was heaving, hurting, and fleeing for his life amid the noise of wings. The next, all he could hear was a low whisper in the far corner of his mind. Come inside. The hornet scattered. Shocked, Richard turned and looked up at the sky, which was gathering dark clouds now. The hornets, who had just been chasing him, were keeping their distance from the warehouse doors. He didn't know why, but right now he didn't care. He ran into his apartment complex, taking advantage of its thick stone walls. It seemed everyone had already evacuated. He couldn't even hear Koi Kapul's television playing in his first-floor apartment. Running into no one else as he went up the stairs, he completed his journey towards his apartment with relative ease. He was safe. But he wasn't well. Inside, his room would be empty, just as he had left it. So, are you my brother now? Echoed Kevin's voice. Tears fell from Richard's eyes. He couldn't get Kevin's little hopeful gaze out of his brain. Somehow, he felt he had drawn mankind's predator to their house. He just shouldn't have been there. Don't worry about protecting people, Rich. Not if it'll get everybody killed, Bry had said. That's right. He was supposed to run, to survive. But thinking about that now only made it worse. All he needed was one ride home, yet for the past 2 weeks, he'd been seduced into believing he could have a family again. And now Roger's warm, reassuring smile was nowhere to be seen. I should have done something, Richard muttered again, caressing his chest wounds, cold tears dripping onto his fingers. Sssss. He heard a noise outside, whispering in his ears. 2040 AD, 5 years ago. Just relax, Mr. Renovon, a man said. Richard was lying on his back. He wiggled his fingers, and his arms throbbed with pain. He tried to move his feet, but he couldn't feel them. Something wet was caked to his skin. He was bleeding. Come on, Mr. Renovon. Let's get you off the floor. A short man with wrinkled skin, hair like wilting grass, and sticks for arms was reaching down for him. Richard would have to push himself up, even as nauseous and dizzy as he was. There was just no way this little man would be able to get him off the ground. Yet no matter how hard he tried, Richard wouldn't move. The little man scooped him right off the ground. My name is Coy Kapoor. I'm the proprietor of this building complex. The doctor is on his way. He helped Richard to a cot and lifted his head to slide a soft pillow underneath. His words came slowly, like he was choosing each one with extraordinary care. Do you remember anything? He kept eye contact with Richard for just a few seconds before they trailed to the floor, and Richard opened his mouth to speak, but his insides betrayed him. He fought the urge to vomit. With what little energy he had, he raised his hand and felt his stomach. Not only was it torn up, but it was sunken in. His fingers wandered up to his ribs, and all he could feel were the bones. I think you should be still, Kapoor said. Richard remembered yearning to fall asleep. He'd even closed his eyes in an attempt to nod off, but couldn't. Trying to lift himself up, the pain and nausea were too much to bear. He sank his head back into the pillow, and as they waited for the doctor, the minutes dragged on, and Richard found it less painful not to speak. He wanted to ask the man so many questions. Who was he? Why were they helping him? Where were they? Kapoor answered all that without being asked. He told Richard he was in the town of Ark, a place for refugees hailing from Los Angeles, from beyond the southern border, or even from the Trail of Blood, if they were lucky enough to survive. Some of that sounded familiar to Richard, but when he tried to form a memory, it was like some invisible hand pulled a veil over his eyes. When the doctor came, he took one look at Richard and called an ambulance. Richard spent the next month in the hospital. He returned to the apartment high on morphine, his limbs no longer quivering, although he was still pitifully frail. The doctor had explained to him that in the town of Ark, people were divided based on their usefulness. He warned that without a strong body, Richard would not be able to contribute much. With no family to provide for him either, he might starve. Get a job, and Mayor Merrick will take care of you. Stay home, you're on your own. Richard had no idea what to do. Could barely stand up, barely keep food down, couldn't even pick things up. His wrists had deep black slits with ugly purple butterfly stitches holding the skin together. The doctor had also found chafe marks, which he said were evidence of handcuffs or shackles, leading some of the staff to worry that they had an escaped criminal on their hands. For all he knew, they were right. His mind was locked down. For that first month before he was booted from the ER for staying well past the deadline, he was certain he would die. Ironically, it was the proprietor who kept him alive. He remembered Kapoor coming up to his room, seeing him sprawled out on his bed as if just waiting to die, and frantically bringing him 3 meals a day, whatever medicine he needed, all out of his own pocket. He even hired a physical trainer who visited Richard 3 times per week. In their conversations, Richard received a hopeful message about Ark. You've been through a hard time, Mr. Renovon, like everyone else here. Some days you may want to throw in the towel, but there's so much to live for here. Mayor Merrick is going to turn this small town into a haven for all people, where we can live free of mankind's predator. You don't want to miss that, do you? Coy Kapoor, though, eventually showed his true colors. As Richard's training continued, it seemed the man grew more and more disgruntled at what a daily chore Richard was. 1 year into Richard's residence at Kapoor Commons, the proprietor finally voiced his disdain. You're no good, you know that? No good at all. You should be dead, but somebody loved you enough to. And he suddenly grew very stiff, like a cat that had spotted its own shadow, and he scampered off. Once, thinking they'd just gotten off on the wrong foot, Richard went down to the proprietor's apartment and knocked on the door. He could see a shadow blanketing the light just under the door and hear muffled voices, possibly from a radio or television, but no one came to the door. After waiting a while, Richard returned to his lonely room. Whenever Kapoor wanted rent money, he put a letter in Richard's mailbox. Whenever Richard paid, he slipped the paper in Kapoor's mailbox. The trainer also grew impatient with Richard. His long-winded words of encouragement thinned into curt commands. Eventually, he made as little eye contact with Richard as possible. Regardless, both men tugged something loose from Richard's soul. He developed a strong desire to live. As his wrists regained their functioning, as he built his body strong, he became the silent giant that Ark knew him to be. When Richard finally left his exhaustingly tedious job at Claymore's Tavern and picked up a hammer for the first time on Roger Marlton's crew, he realized that his strength gave him comfort. Relying on nothing but the powerful arms he'd built up, Richard's anxieties diminished. Working at a job in which he excelled, filling up his time with nothing but the next stone to break, it all quieted Richard's heart and made it more bearable to live with his confusing, dark chamber. Then, one day, in 2144 AD, there came a knock on his door. While he was laying there with a quieted heart, stretching out comfortably in bed after a long day's work, a scream had pierced the night. It came right through their window and quickly morphed into an inhuman fusion of sounds, a wolf's howl mixed with a bear's roar. That's how he would have described it. He heard doors opening out in the hall. "What, the trail?" someone said. The wind picked up, but it wasn't enough to smother the echoing roars. "That's just the wind. That is not wind. That's mankind's predator." Clamoring voices muffled the noise until the wind died down. When they finally stopped talking, Richard, cowering in his room, heard nothing but the silence of the night. Until his phone buzzed. A code green had been issued. All residents were to stay put, which they did for hours. Then, in the odd hours of the morning, there was another knock at his door. "Who is it?" "Your landlord." Surprised, Richard cautiously pulled the door open. Staring down at Koi Kapul with his rejuvenated body, he thought he seemed like he'd shrunk 4 feet and grown twice as abrasive. "Code green is over." Richard stared at him blankly, which further agitated the old man. "You did hear that earlier, right? Coming from the terrace?" "Yeah," Richard said. "Did they find out what it was?" "They didn't find dirt." "Whatever it was, I'll bet it was after your property." "My property?" Richard asked. The landlord turned his shoulder and pointed down the stairs. "Come with me," he said. "I'll show you." He followed the proprietor down to the first floor, assuming he would be led into the man's apartment, but he was wrong. Kapul opened the front door and they stepped out into the brisk night air. They walked only a short distance to a warehouse right next to Kapul Commons. The proprietor turned a key while Richard looked up at the burning Empire State Building, following the man into a dark room. "Do you own this place too?" Richard asked. "Yes," Kapul growled. He undid the lock on a large crate and turned to Richard. "You're strong enough now. Open it up, see for yourself." Richard pushed the crate's lid up and over the edge, placing it gently to lean on the box's side. With how dark the room was, however, he couldn't see what was inside. Richard switched on a flashlight, mumbling, "Damn the bills in this town." Light shone into the crate, showing Richard a long object wrapped in 2 blankets. It was perfectly bundled into a cylinder. Richard reached in and started to undo the wrapping. When he cleared it away, he saw the tip of the object, a red ruby, staring up at him like a glistening red eye. "You like it?" asked Kapul in a sarcastic tone before raising his right hand. Richard gasped. The old man's palm was tightly bandaged, with swollen skin sticking out along the fingers. "Trust me, you don't want to touch that." Richard turned back to the ruby eye. Curiously, he reached down. He just wanted to see how far his hand would get. It turned out he could rest 2 fingers on the eye before he started to feel any intense heat, like reaching into an oven. He jumped back, gripping his hand and almost crashing into another crate. "What is that?" Kapul stared at him. So you don't know? Richard felt his own heart hammering within his chest, but his mind was blank of all but his body's rush of adrenaline. I don't know. Why are you showing it to me? Kapul took a deep breath. Well, because it's yours. I have the paperwork to prove it. I've never seen it before. Richard's thoughts were spiraling. Kapul crossed his arms, the flashlight pointed down, so Richard couldn't see his face in the dark room. He came to town with you. The former owner, someone I can't quite recall, so don't ask, signed the paperwork right in front of me. When I took it, I was disheartened to see your name under the receipt, not mine. I don't remember any of this. Someone had brought him into town? Who was? I said don't ask, Kapul barked. As the tense moments settled between them, Kapul shone the light back into the crate and peeked inside, a haunted look in his eye. If you don't want it, why not let me get rid of it? Ship it somewhere, maybe L.A. I'd rather not give it to Merrick, who knows what he'd do to me. You want to get rid of it? Richard asked, finding the courage to approach the crate again. Kapul scratched an itch along his stubble. Can make it happen, but I need you to sign the papers. I don't need any legal trouble from you down the road. Richard eyed the crate, tracing the size of the object beneath the blankets. His eyes fell to its edge, and he looked again into that wicked little eye. Okay, he muttered. I've already printed it out. Give me 2 minutes. The landlord started to walk away. But Richard was suddenly transfixed. He heard the noise, too, yet when he tried to turn and walk out of the room, something compelled him to stay. He could have stayed there all night long, staring into that ruby eye. I can help you. Wait, he called. When he said that, the eye glowed brighter. Back to the present. Shadows flickered across Richard's window. He stretched against the wall of his dim apartment, watching them go before he tiptoed across. He heard a pop and threw himself down. A shadow had perched on the window, its little legs crawling over the glass. Richard's dresser was 4 feet off the ground. Like a caterpillar, Richard contracted his muscles, sliding across the carpeted floor. The beast stepped towards his ring of keys, its face invisible. It could have been staring right at him or watching its pals fly around while it took a breather. Richard rolled onto his back and slowly reached up to his keys. Flutter, 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 flutter. He threw himself down. The flutters grew distant, and after a few heart-pounding moments, he looked up to see a barren window, nothing but light attempting to shine through. Richard snatched his keys and ran out the door, descending the dark stairwell. When he reached the door of the apartment building, he hit a second time. 3 hornets fluttered in the air just above the awning. How fast could a palm-sized creature with wings reach him and stab his neck? Would he have 5 seconds? 4? How fast could he get to the warehouse door? Richard started counting. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Flutter, flutter, flutter. Richard dashed out into the street and to the left. He passed the Empire State Building mural, bedecked with fire and painted hornets. He passed the False Hope poster. Hornets fluttered just over his head as he turned the key. Ow! He screamed as a beast stabbed him in the shoulder. He pushed the door open, spun, and threw it shut, catching close sight of 2 golden hornets' beady eyes and wide, salivating fangs as they lodged themselves in the shutting door. With 1 in his shoulder and 2 at the door, Richard was swiftly overpowered. How could such little creatures be this strong? Richard heaved and shoved, hoping he could use the door to saw them in half, but they just chirped and cackled as they forced it open. Richard slipped, and his hands fell off the surface of the door, which crashed open. The golden hornets poured into the warehouse, dripping their toxin everywhere. Richard crawled backwards as they emitted distorted laughter, each of them illuminated in the dim, invasive light. One still clung to his shoulder, making it harder for him to move. A drop of its own blood sprayed into his lips, and he tasted iron. The hornet's spit smelled like rotten food. It had already eaten today. He tried to pry it off his shoulder, then a cold gust of wind filled the room, and there was a flash of red light ahead. As a whispering voice filled Richard's ears, the hornet that had just been trying to kill him ripped free of him and frantically flew out the door. The rest quickly followed, and when they were gone, Richard slammed the door and locked it. Let me pause real quick to check in with the comments. See how y'all are doing out here tonight. Okay. For those of you just tuning in, we are reading The Children of Ark, my most recent published book. And I just wanted to check something real quick. It is currently on Amazon at a very competitive price. So, if you are liking what you're hearing and you would like to click the purchase button, I strongly encourage it. You would be supporting a local author, helping his name get noticed amongst all the others. Alrighty, so Richard had slammed the door and locked it. So, let's continue. He crept through the dark with one hand on his bleeding shoulder, still feeling that icy chill throughout the room. His eyes adjusted to the dark, and he saw crates stacked upon crates, forming piles as tall as trees. In the center of this boxy forest, he saw his crate, isolated from the rest. Richard knelt and gently undid the lock. It unclipped with an echo around the room, and as he slipped it off, he smelled charcoal. Heat rose under his hands as the object's red light filled the dark space just around the crate. Now he could see inside. The object was still there, right where he had left it, but its eye had burned through part of the cotton blankets wrapped around it. The eye was a red, burning gem, and at its center he saw a little black triangle with a dot in the middle, like a pupil. He started to pull back the curtain to reveal more of what this eye connected to, and suddenly the mark on his finger was pinching him again, and he recalled what had happened the last time he was here. "You're awake," he said to it. The luminescent gem did not answer him. "I'm talking to an object," he muttered. His shoulder flared with pain, and he held it in a fruitless struggle to stop that pain. When he did this, the object seemed to burn even hotter, the eye glowing brighter. Like a fireplace, the longer he looked at it, the drier his eyes became, yet he could not look away. As he lifted the cloth from which the ruby protruded, his hand started to boil, like he truly had reached into an oven. Richard pulled back and stood over the box. Its fiendish light rose to the ceiling, casting a red gleam over the blister on Richard's finger, his only reward for touching the eye. He realized that if he had any hope of moving forward, he would have to touch it, this time with his whole palm. "Don't touch any of theirs," his big brother's warning echoed. But he had to. Years ago, he'd looked away from this thing. Now he knew he was to blame for the dead bodies all over town, including Evelyn's. If he just faced this thing sooner, if he'd taken its power, he could have defended them. Every second he spent hiding and listening to the sounds of death were seconds that he had committed murder, and now he had to make it right. "You said you can help me," he said as he reached inside. "Help me." He shut his eyes and thrust his hand into that oven, taking hold of the wooden cylinder attached to the eye, which shone brighter upon his touch. Richard expected that now he would wake from this dream and find his hand pressed upon a sweltering stove burner. But as the pain went on, he remained in this dark room. He screamed as steam rose from the crate and sweat rolled down his temple. When the pain became too great, he let go of the grip and fell backwards, clutching his swollen, burned hand. His flesh had expanded and peeled. He felt the heat of the grip biting at him persistently, no matter how he covered his palm. His thoughts cried out for ice water, something to thrust his hand into, but he knew even that wouldn't stop this kind of pain. After 10 deep breaths, the burning spasms continued, and tears leaked from his eyes as he crawled backwards, away from the light. He had to get out of this room. Yes, he had to run. Oh, poor little Richard. Always running, always crying. He was back under that tree. Lost? Alone? No, his back was pressed up against a stack of crates that were much like a tree. He was an ark, but it was happening all over again. He sobbed. Yes, cry. That's all you'll ever be good for. It was like he was hearing his own voice, but they didn't feel anything like his own thoughts. It was like someone sounded just like him and was whispering into his ear. Every word cut into his worst fears and insecurities. He was weak. He had to run. That's all Richard Renovant had ever done since he was born into this crisis. What good was he? Ark was right to treat him as useless, to decry him as a silent giant. Unless, of course, he changed that. Richard stood up, still cradling his blistered hand. He slowly approached the light rising out of the crate. With every step, his mind filled with dark visions. He was picturing all the Marletons dead, mankind's predator attacked, and death was just the beginning. Next would come the utter destruction of every inch of land, including all trace of every person and family. Your life and your family's lives would be forgotten, erased. He sat down at the table with his mother, father, and brother, surrounded by wood on all sides, smelling candle wax and fresh hibiscus. His father set salmon on the table, garnished with parsley. His big brother smiled at him and invited him to lean down and smell what they were about to eat. But as soon as Richard leaned down, his brother started choking. He turned to his father and found his bloody chest riddled with daggers. And as they both fell, his mother coughed, choked, and thinned into a skeletal form. One by one, they fell at Richard's feet, and the table crumbled into dust. Everyone was dying, and it was all his fault. He wanted to take a dagger to his skull and cut the images out of his head. Instead, he reached into the crate again. He tried to lift the object this time, pushing back on the pain. He might as well have tried to lift a boulder. His muscles tore in conjunction with his palm. The eye glinted, and his hand burned even hotter. His perspiration accelerated until his haywire hair was dampened. He cried out loud as his palm and the tips of his fingers filled with the sensation of needles. As that feeling endured and intensified, he saw a black discoloration running through his veins, traveling up his arm. They hated you. You were a burden to them. You're a burden to Ark. Just one more useless mouth to feed. Richard let go, falling out of the light and into the blanketing darkness. Now he felt like his hand had been torn off. When he dared look down, it was still there, but the black veins stayed. He'd infected himself. His blood would be poisoned. He was going to die. Richard crawled backwards towards the darkness and regretted ever having come in here. He couldn't do this. His brother had taught him to fight and to endure pain, but he hadn't taught him to endure this. This was too much for someone like him, someone who was only good at crying. If you cry again, you're getting a beating, his father's voice echoed. Standing behind their father's back, Brian Jr. was powerless. Facing their father, looking up into his eyes, Richard was overwhelmed. He wanted to run down to the harbor and throw himself into it. Instead, he yelled, "Why do you hate me so much?" His father knelt and seized Richard's shoulders without a shred of sympathy in his voice. "I don't hate you, boy. I want you to survive." Richard opened his tear-stricken eyes, holding up his blackened, blistered hand so that he could see it in the faint haze of red. The aggressive voice faded away, and he began to hear his brothers. He remembered a day when Bri had told him something. "Mankind's predator, they're already dead, little bro. That's why they hate us so much. We're still alive. They want what we have, so you have to survive, just like Dad says. You have to remember everything I teach you, and you have to be willing to endure all the pain so you don't get eaten. But you also need to hold on to yourself. Too many people, even Dad, are letting beasts turn them into beasts. If that keeps up, none of us will last. So you have to survive and also hold on to yourself." "How?" Richard had asked him, being too young to know what a sense of self even was. "You have to remember Mom," Bri said. "Remember everything she did for us, every word she said." And Richard did remember, even if so many other memories were lost. What was something his mother had told him repeatedly, always with such a gentle, warm voice? Remember everyone who takes care of you, son. And when you get older, you take care of them. Richard staggered to his feet and stared down into that red furnace. One more flash of Evelyn Marlton's corpse pinched his thoughts, followed by his brother's, his father's, and his mother's. One last thought fell upon him. While he was cowering here, Roger and Kevin might be next. They'd opened their home to him, cared for him, just like she said. So what was he doing for them right now? He took a long breath, bared his teeth, and reached a third time. By then, the ruby eye was swirling with pink smoke. It sweltered like steam, yet hovered continuously around the eye, like an aura of light that would accompany a torch. This time, when he touched the grip, the aura scattered like flares around his wrist and crawled up his right arm, turning his blood to ice. His skin's protective barrier had already burned off. Now his palm was melting to the bone. That chilling hiss crawled up the back of his neck, and his thoughts were narrowed with anger. The putrid stench of tanning leather filled his nostrils. But Richard held on, his cries turning to roars as the pain and the chill started to feel more like vibrations. His body numbed from neck to ankle as the misty aura covered his arm. Wherever it touched, he felt his muscles hardening. He saw the blankets burning away to reveal a crossguard with 12 hooked teeth woven into the wooden grip, crowned by that ruby eye. The misty vapor dissipated, and the room darkened until only the faint light from the box could be seen. Then Richard felt its weight drop to that of a feather and stood. Richard Renovon drew a sword from the crate, holding it up so that its light filled the room. The pommel blazed like a lantern, and the long pink blade glinted with that same fiery incandescence. Taking in the shape of the pommel to the crossguard to the hooked teeth behind the blade, Richard imagined he was holding the head of a beast. This was an artifact blade, the weapon of a demon knight. Richard held a power stronger than a knife, bullet, or any other man-made object. It filled him with a passion to walk back outside to the sandy streets and face mankind's predator again. Droplets of blood fell from Richard's burned palm, forming a trail from the crate to the door. He left them without a glance. Whew, need a swig of water after that. All right. How we doing out here? I see a lot of people are watching. Thank you so much for tuning in to this live reading of The Children of Arc, book by me. All right. So that's pretty much where we're going to leave it for tonight. You know what they say, always leave them wanting more. So now you all know what this book is about. It's about a thing called the Artifact Blade, and it's in the main character's hand. And now that he's overcome this trial and he has the weapon, we'll see what he does with it. That's going to be tomorrow at 9:30 sharp, from about 9:30 to 10:15, maybe even 10:30, because a lot of action happens on the next pages. We'll try to get through a lot of it. But I'm really excited that you guys came on and watched. Thank you so much for enjoying. And if you're just coming on the stream at the end, the link to buy the book is in the bio if you'd like to read it for yourself or read along with the stream. It's always great to have you guys out here. And I think we're going to definitely make it through the whole book, probably by the end of next month. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. And I'll leave you with this quick trailer. See what you think of this. Good night, everybody.